A rare photo of sea breeze in Tochostatiente, South Carolina, that will haunt you. The discovery, Dr. Sarah Williams had spent 15 years as a curator at the Charleston Museum of History, but nothing had prepared her for the photograph that arrived on her desk on a sweltering August morning. The image came wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, nestled inside a climate-controlled shipping container that bore the return address of the Beaumont Estate Liquidation Company. The accompanying letter was brief and businesslike, found in the attic of the Beaumont Plantation House during estate clearing. Appears to be historical. Thought your museum might be interested. It was signed by Rebecca Thornton, estate manager, with a phone number and nothing more. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the photograph. In her years of working with historical artifacts, she had developed an instinct for recognizing truly significant discoveries, and this image immediately set off every alarm bell in her professional consciousness. The photograph was remarkably well preserved, protected by what appeared to be an early form of glass plate mounting. The image quality was extraordinary, for what the accompanying documentation suggested was an Intervinto 20 daguerreotype, a technology that had barely been invented at that time, making this potentially one of the earliest photographic documents of American slavery ever discovered. But it wasn't just the historic significance that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was the content of the image itself. The photograph showed a group of enslaved people standing in front of what appeared to be slave quarters, rough wooden buildings with dirt floors visible through open doorways. The composition was formal, almost portrait-like, suggesting that this had been a deliberate augmentation rather than a candid capture. In the foreground stood a family, a man, woman, and 3 children, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 15 years old. Their clothing was the rough homespun fabric typical of enslaved people's garments, patched and worn, but clean. The family members stood close together, the parents' hands protectively placed on their children's shoulders, but it was their faces that would haunt Sarah for weeks to come. Unlike many historical photographs, where subjects appeared stoic or expressionless due to long exposure times, these faces were remarkably clear and emotionally expressive. The father's eyes held a mixture of dignity and barely contained rage. The mother's face showed exhaustion and worry, but also a fierce protectiveness as she looked down at her youngest child. The children's expressions ranged from confusion to premature wisdom, the look of young people who had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. Behind the family, other enslaved people were visible in various poses of daily life. Some were engaged in work activities, a woman hanging laundry, a man repairing what appeared to be a tool, an elderly woman sitting on a wooden stool with her hands folded in her lap. Others simply stood or sat, their faces turned toward the camera with expressions that seemed to span the full range of human emotion. What made the image particularly powerful was its composition. Unlike many historical documents that depicted enslaved people as anonymous laborers or property, this photograph captured them as individuals with distinct personalities and emotions. Each face told a story, and together they created a collective narrative of resilience in the face of unimaginable oppression. Sarah reached for her magnifying glass, studying the details more closely. The quality of the image was so sharp that she could make out individual threads in the clothing, the texture of the wooden buildings, even the expressions in people's eyes. This level of detail was virtually unprecedented. As she examined the background of the image, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. Partially visible at the edge of the frame was a white man in formal dress, top hat, long coat, and what appeared to be a walking stick. His presence in the photograph raised immediate questions about the circumstances under which this image had been created. Had this been documentation commissioned by the plantation owner? Was it evidence for some legal proceeding, or had it been created for some other purpose entirely? The formal nature of the composition suggested that significant time and effort had been invested in creating this image, which would have been expensive and technically challenging. Sarah's initial examination also revealed what appeared to be writing on the back of the photograph's mounting. The text was faded and difficult to read, but she could make out what looked like names and dates. This could potentially provide crucial information about the identities of the people in the photograph, information that was almost never preserved in historical documents about enslaved people. Array photo of slavery in Puerto and South Carolina. That will haunt you. The more Sarah studied the photograph, the more questions arose. The technical quality suggested this was genuine, but the early date raised significant doubts. Daguerreotypes had been invented in 1839, nearly 20 years after the date suggested for this image. Could this be an early experiment in photography that had been lost to history? Or was there something else about this image that she wasn't understanding? Sarah knew she needed expert help to properly authenticate and analyze this discovery. She reached for her phone to call Dr. Marcus Thompson, a specialist in early American photography at the University of South Carolina. If anyone could help her understand what she was looking at, it would be Marcus. But even as she dialed his number, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this photograph was going to change everything she thought she knew about the documentation of slavery in America. The faces in the image seemed to be looking directly at her across 2 centuries, demanding that their stories be told and their humanity be recognized. Whatever the truth about this photograph's origins, Sarah was determined to uncover it. The people in this image deserved to have their stories preserved and shared, and she was going to make sure that happened. Dr. Marcus Thompson arrived at the Charleston Museum within hours of Sarah's call, his curiosity piqued by her description of the mysterious photograph. A tall, scholarly man with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, Marcus had spent 25 years studying early American photography and had developed a reputation as one of the foremost experts in authentication of historical images. "Show me what you found," he said, without preamble, settling into the chair beside Sarah's examination table. Sarah carefully removed the photograph from its protective housing and placed it under the museum's high-powered magnification system. Marcus leaned forward, his expression shifting from casual interest to intense concentration as he studied the image. "The technical quality is extraordinary," he murmured, adjusting the magnification, the clarity, the depth of field, the tonal range. "This is far superior to what I would expect from the 1920s photography technology." "That's what concerns me," Sarah replied. "The date doesn't match the technical capabilities, but the mounting and the aging patterns suggest this is genuinely old." Marcus spent the next hour examining every aspect of the photograph. He studied the paper composition, the mounting materials, the aging patterns of the image itself, and the chemical composition of what appeared to be the photographic emulsion. His examination was methodical and thorough, the approach of a scientist here rather than simply an art historian. "The mounting is definitely period appropriate," he said finally. "The glass, the backing materials, even the adhesive used, all consistent with early 19th century technique. For the photographic process," he paused, frowning, "this doesn't match any known daguerreotype or calotype process from that era." Sarah had been researching the Beaumont plantation while Marcus conducted his technical analysis. What she had discovered added another layer of mystery to the photograph's origins. The Beaumont plantation was owned by Jonathan Beaumont, a wealthy rice planter who inherited the property from his father and it. But here's what's interesting: Jonathan Beaumont was known to be fascinated by scientific innovations. He corresponded with inventors and scientists throughout Europe and America, and he had a reputation for experimenting with new technologies on his plantation. Marcus looked up from his examination. That could explain the advanced photographic technique. If Beaumont was experimenting with early photographic processes, He might have developed methods that were ahead of their time. They decided to examine the writing on the back of the photograph's mounting more closely. Using specialized lighting and magnification, they were able to make out several lines of faded text written in what appeared to be period-appropriate ink. The first line read Beaumont Plantation, Charleston District, South Carolina. Below that, in different handwriting document, and finally, in a third hand, subject Cesar, age 35, Dina, age 30, Samuel, age 15, Mary, age 10, Joseph, age 5, and others, as noted. Names, Sarah Fipper. They actually recorded their names. This was an extraordinary discovery. In the vast majority of historical documents from the slavery era, enslaved people were referred to only by their first names, if they were named at all. More often they were simply listed as property in inventories and bills of sale. To have full documentation of a family group with ages and relationships was virtually unprecedented. Marcus continued reading the faded text. There's more here, it looks like. Experimental photographic documentation for legal proceedings, Commonwealth versus Bayonne. Legal proceedings, Sarah said, her mind racing. What kind of legal case would require photographic documentation of enslaved people in Wendio 120? They spent the rest of the afternoon researching court records from Charleston in Wendio 120, looking for any case involving Jonathan Beaumont. What they found was a complex legal dispute that shed new light on the circumstances surrounding the photograph. In early 1820, Jonathan Beaumont had been accused by a neighboring planter, Thomas Whitfield, of harboring runaway slaves. Whitfield claimed that several of his enslaved people had escaped to the Beaumont plantation and were being hidden there. The case had become a significant legal controversy because it involved questions about property rights, the obligations of plantation owners to return escaped slaves, and the reliability of testimony from enslaved people themselves. A rare photo of slavery in Morios Nightos 20, South Carolina, that will haunt you. The court records revealed that Beaumont had commissioned the photograph as evidence in his defense. He had wanted to document the enslaved people on his plantation to prove that the individuals in question had been part of his workforce for years and were not recent arrivals from Whitfield's plantation. This explains the formal composition, Marcos observed. This wasn't just documentation, it was legal evidence. Beaumont needed to create a clear, detailed record that could be presented in court. But the legal context raised troubling questions about the circumstances under which the photograph had been taken. The enslaved people in the image would have had no choice about participating in this documentation. They were being photographed not for their own benefit, but as evidence in a legal dispute between white plantation owners. Sarah studied the faces in the photograph with new understanding. The mixture of dignity and defiance she had noticed in their expressions took on new meaning when viewed in the context of a legal proceeding. These people were being forced to stand as evidence in a case that would determine their fate, yet they had managed to maintain their humanity and individuality even in this dehumanizing situation. The technical analysis also revealed details that had not been immediately apparent. Under high magnification, Marcus was able to identify what appeared to be scars on several of the adults in the photograph, evidence of the physical violence that was an integral part of the slavery system. More subtly, the positioning of the family members suggested relationships and protective instincts that transcended their legal status as property. The way the parents positioned themselves in relation to their children, the protective gestures, the subtle touches, all spoke to the preservation of family bonds despite the system's attempts to reduce them to mere economic units. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a detail in the background of the photograph. "There's a woman partially visible behind the main family group. She's holding what appears to be an infant." Sarah adjusted the magnification to study the area Marcus had indicated. The woman was indeed holding a baby, and her expression was one of fierce protectiveness. But what was most striking was that she appeared to be positioning herself to shield the child from the camera's view. She's trying to protect the baby from being documented, Sarah realized. Even in this controlled situation, she's finding ways to resist. This detail added another layer to their understanding of the photograph. While the main subjects had been required to pose for the camera, the people in the background had found subtle ways to assert their agency and protect their loved ones from the invasive documentation. As their analysis continued, Sarah and Marcus began to understand that they were looking at more than just a historical photograph. They were seeing evidence of resistance, dignity, and humanity preserved in the face of a system designed to deny all three. The people in this image had found ways to assert their individuality and maintain their family bonds even while being reduced to evidence in a legal proceeding. The authentication process would take several more days, but Marcus was already convinced that they were dealing with a genuine historical artifact of extraordinary significance. The technical analysis, the historical context, and the documentary evidence all supported the photograph's authenticity. But more importantly, they had uncovered the names and stories of people who had been lost to history. Caesar, Dina, Samuel, Mary, and Joseph, a family whose existence had been preserved, not by choice, but by the accident of a legal dispute and an experimental photographic process. Sarah's research into the Commonwealth vs. Beaumont revealed a complex legal drama that provided crucial context for understanding the photograph. The case files, preserved in the South Carolina State Archives, painted a picture of a society grappling with the contradictions and tensions inherent in the slavery system. The dispute had begun in February 1820, when Thomas Whitfield, owner of the neighboring Riverside plantation, accused Jonathan Beaumont of harboring 3 of his escaped slaves. Whitfield claimed that the individuals in question, 2 men and a woman, had fled his plantation during a particularly harsh winter and had been given shelter at the Beaumont estate. What made the case unusual was Beaumont's response to the accusations. Rather than simply denying the charges or returning the alleged runaways, Beaumont had challenged the fundamental premise of Whitfield's claim. He argued that the 3 individuals had been part of his workforce for several years and provided documentation to support his position. The court record revealed that this was not simply a dispute over property, but a conflict that touched on some of the most contentious issues of the era. Questions of identity, documentation, and the legal status of enslaved people were all central to the case. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, a legal historian at the College of Charleston, joined Sarah and Marcus in their investigation. Her expertise in antebellum law provided crucial insights into the significance of the Beaumont case. This type of dispute was actually quite common, Dr. Hayes explained. The mobility of enslaved people, whether through escape, sale, or transfer, created constant problems of identification and ownership. But what makes the Beaumont case unusual is the level of documentation in total legal files revealed that Beaumont had gone to extraordinary lengths to prove his case. In addition to the photograph, he had provided written testimony from overseers, bills of sale dating back several years, and even testimony from other enslaved people on his plantation. The photograph was just one piece of evidence, Dr. Hayes continued, but it was revolutionary for its time. The idea of using visual documentation in a legal proceeding was virtually unprecedented. The case files also provided more details about the 3 individuals at the center of the dispute. The 2 men were identified as Marcus, approximately 30 years old, and David, approximately 30. All 3 were described as skilled workers, Marcus and David as carpenters, Ruth as a seamstress and house servant. What emerged from the testimony was a picture of 3 people who had indeed escaped from the Whitfield plantation, but who had been living and working at the Beaumont estate for nearly 2 years before Whitfield discovered their whereabouts. During that time, They had established themselves as valuable members of the Beaumont workforce and had even started families with other enslaved people on the plantation. This raises fascinating questions about the nature of escape and refuge in the slavery system. Dr. Hayes observed, these weren't people who had fled to the north or to freedom. They had simply moved from one plantation to another, but in doing so, they had created new lives and new identities. The legal proceedings had dragged on for months, with both sides presenting extensive evidence. The case had attracted significant attention in Charleston society because it involved questions about property rights that affected all plantation owners. A rare photo of slavery in 1920 South Carolina that will haunt you. The photograph had been commissioned as part of Beaumont's defense strategy. His lawyers had argued that the three individuals in question were clearly integrated into the Beaumont's plantation community and could not be the recent escapees that Whitfield claimed them to be. But the legal strategy raised troubling ethical questions. The photograph documented not just the three disputed individuals, but an entire community of enslaved people who had no say in how their images were being used. They were being reduced to evidence in a legal proceeding that would determine not just the fate of three individuals, but potentially set precedents for how similar cases would be handled in the future. Sarah studied the photograph with new understanding of its legal context. The formal composition now made perfect sense. This was evidence that needed to be clear, detailed, and convincing to a court. But the human cost of creating this evidence was staggering. The family in the foreground, Caesar, Dina, and their children, had been required to pose for this documentation not for their own benefit, but to serve the legal interests of their owner. Their dignity and humanity had been preserved in the image, but only as an accidental byproduct of a process designed to treat them as property. The case files revealed the ultimate outcome of the legal proceeding. In a decision that surprised many observers, the court had ruled in favor of Beaumont. The judge had determined that the evidence, including the photograph, demonstrated that the three individuals had been established members of the Beaumont plantation community for a sufficient period of time to establish new legal ownership. But the victory had come at a cost. The court's decision had established a precedent that made it more difficult for enslaved people to escape and establish new lives, even within the slavery system. The case had strengthened the legal mechanisms for tracking and reclaiming enslaved people, making escape even more dangerous and difficult. Dr. Hayes discovered additional documents that revealed the aftermath of the case. Thomas Whitfield had been required to pay court costs and had suffered a significant blow to his reputation in Charleston society. Jonathan Beaumont had emerged victorious, but the legal proceedings had cost him a considerable sum in lawyers' fees and court expenses. More tragically, the three individuals at the center of the dispute had paid the highest price of all. While they had been allowed to remain at the Beaumont plantation, their legal status had been clarified in ways that made future escape virtually impossible. They had been documented, photographed, and legally bound to their new owner in ways that eliminated any ambiguity about their status. The case files also revealed that the legal precedent established by Commonwealth v. Beaumont had been cited in numerous subsequent cases throughout the antebellum period. The use of photographic evidence had become more common, and the legal mechanisms for tracking and reclaiming enslaved people had been strengthened. This case represents a turning point in the legal treatment of enslaved people. Dr. Hayes concluded. The use of photographic documentation marked the beginning of more sophisticated methods of control and surveillance. What seemed like a victory for Beaumont was actually a strengthening of the entire system of slavery. As Sarah Marcus and Dr. Hayes continued their research, they began to understand that the photograph represented more than just a historical artifact. It was evidence of a legal system that had reduced human beings to property, and of the sophisticated methods that had been developed to maintain and enforce that reduction. but it was also evidence of resistance and resilience. Despite being forced to participate in their own documentation as property, the people in the photograph had managed to preserve their dignity and humanity. Their faces, captured for legal purposes, had become a testament to their strength and their refusal to be completely dehumanized by the system that enslaved them. As the research team delved deeper into the historical records, they began to uncover the individual stories of the people captured in the photograph. What had started as a legal document was revealing itself to be a window into the lives, relationships, and experiences of a community of enslaved people whose stories had been largely lost to history. The plantation records from the Beaumont estate, discovered in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, provided unprecedented detail about the daily lives of the enslaved community. Unlike many plantation records that simply listed people as property, Jonathan Beaumont's meticulous documentation included personal information, family relationships, and even individual skills and personality. Caesar, the father in the central family group, was described in the records as a skilled blacksmith and leader among the quarters. The notation suggested that he held a position of respect and authority within the enslaved community, serving as an informal mediator in disputes and a spokesperson when dealing with the plantation management. The records revealed that Caesar had been born on the Beaumont plantation around 1885, making him one of the few enslaved people who had spent his entire life on the same estate. His skills as a blacksmith had made him valuable to the plantation's operations, and his status had afforded him certain privileges, including the ability to maintain a stable family unit. Dina, Caesar's wife, had arrived at the plantation in 1810 as part of a group of enslaved people purchased from a failing estate in Georgia. The records described her as skilled in textile work and midwifery, indicating that she played crucial roles in both the economic and social life of the plantation community. What made Dina's story particularly poignant was the discovery that she had been separated from her first family when she was sold to the Beaumont plantation. The Georgia estate records, painstakingly tracked down by Sarah's research team, revealed that Dina had left behind 2 young children when she was sold. The trauma of this separation would have been a constant presence in her life, even as she built a new family with Caesar. The 3 children in the photograph, Samuel, Mary, and Joseph, represented hope and continuity for their parents, but also the constant fear that characterized family life under slavery. The plantation records showed that all 3 children had been born on the Beaumont estate and had been allowed to remain with their parents, a privilege that was never guaranteed under the slavery system. Samuel, the eldest at 15, was described in the records as showing aptitude for carpentry and mechanical work. This notation suggested that he was being trained for skilled labor that would make him valuable to the plantation's operations. But it also meant that his future was being determined by economic considerations rather than his own interests or abilities. 10-year-old Mary was noted as assisting in the house and showing promise in needlework. The records indicated that she was being prepared for domestic service, which would likely mean separation from her family, as she took on responsibilities in the main house. 5-year-old Joseph was simply described as healthy and well-grown, the kind of notation that emphasized his potential economic value rather than his personality or individual characteristics. A rare photo of slavery in 1890 South Carolina that will haunt you. The research team also uncovered information about the other individuals visible in the photograph. The elderly woman sitting on the wooden stool was identified as Aunt Chloe, a woman who had been born into slavery in the 1720s and had lived through the Revolutionary War, the establishment of the new nation, and the expansion of the plantation system. Aunt Chloe's story was particularly remarkable. The records indicated that she had been purchased by Jonathan Beaumont's father as a young woman and had spent over 60 years on the plantation. She had served as a midwife, healer, and informal leader of the women's community. Her advanced age and accumulated wisdom had earned her a position of respect that transcended her legal status as property. The woman hanging laundry in the background was identified as Patience, a woman in her 30s who had arrived at the plantation as part of the same group as Dina. The recorders described her as reliable in household duties and skilled in cooking, but they also contained hints of a more complex story. A notation from Dio Tolestins indicated that Patience had attempted to escape from the plantation, but had been recaptured after 3 days. The punishment for her escape attempt had been severe, but she had survived and had apparently accepted her circumstances. The photograph captured her engaged in the mundane task of hanging laundry, but her story represented the constant tension between acceptance and resistance that characterized life under slavery. The man repairing tools in the background was identified as Solomon, described in the records as skilled in carpentry and mechanical repair. Solomon's story intersected with the legal case that had prompted the photograph's creation. He was one of the witnesses who had testified about the length of time that Marcus, David, and Ruth had been living on the plantation. The testimony revealed that Solomon had played a crucial role in helping the 3 escapees integrate into the Beaumont plantation community. He had provided them with tools, taught them the routines and expectations of their new environment, and helped them establish relationships with other enslaved people on the estate. But Solomon's assistance had come at personal risk. If the court had ruled against Beaumont, Solomon could have faced severe punishment for his role in harboring the escapees. His willingness to help them and to testify on their behalf represented a form of resistance and solidarity that operated within the constraints of the slavery system. The research team's investigation also uncovered information about the 3 individuals at the center of the legal dispute. Marcus, David, and Ruth were not visible in the main photograph, but additional plantation records reveal details about their experiences and their integration into the Beaumont community. Marcus had been trained as a carpenter on the Whitfield plantation, but his skills had been underutilized and he had been subjected to particularly harsh treatment. His escape to the Beaumont plantation had been motivated not just by the desire for better conditions, but by the hope of practicing his craft in an environment where his skills would be valued. David's story was more complex. The records indicated that he had been born free in Charleston, but had been illegally enslaved through fraudulent documentation. His escape from the Whitfield plantation had been an attempt to reclaim his freedom, but the legal system had failed to recognize his status and had instead treated him as disputed property. Ruth's story was perhaps the most tragic. She had been separated from her children when she was sold to the Whitfield plantation, and her escape had been motivated by the desperate hope of somehow reuniting with them. The records indicated that her children had been sold to a plantation in Virginia, making reunion virtually impossible. As the research team uncovered these individual stories, the photograph took on new meaning. What had appeared to be a formal documentation of property was revealed to be a complex tableau of human relationships, individual struggles, and community bonds that had persisted despite the dehumanizing effects of slavery. The faces in the photograph were no longer anonymous representatives of an oppressed class. They were individuals with names, stories, and relationships. Kaiser and Dina's protective positioning around their children represented not just parental instinct, but a conscious effort to maintain family bonds in a system designed to destroy them. Aunt Chloe's dignified posture reflected a lifetime of accumulated wisdom and resistance. Solomon's presence in the background represented the networks of mutual support that enabled survival and occasional resistance. The investigation into the photograph's origins led Sarah and her team to explore the identity and motivations of the person who had created this remarkable image. The technical sophistication of the photograph, combined with its early date, suggested that the photographer had been someone with exceptional skill and access to experimental technology. Research into Jonathan Beaumont's correspondence and business records revealed that he had indeed been fascinated by scientific innovations and had maintained extensive correspondence with inventors and experimenters throughout Europe and America. Among his papers preserved in the Beaumont family archives at the South Carolina Historical Society was a series of letters that shed light on the photograph's creation. The correspondence revealed that Beaumont had commissioned the photograph from a French inventor named Henri Dubois, who had been experimenting with photographs. Dubois had arrived in America with letters of introduction from scientific societies in Paris, and had been seeking wealthy patrons to support his experimental work. Dubois' letters to colleagues in France, discovered in the archives of the French Academy of Sciences, provided fascinating insights into his motivations and methods. He had been working to improve upon the early photographic processes developed by Nicephore Niepce, and had achieved remarkable success in reducing exposure times and improving image quality. But what made Dubois's work particularly significant was his interest in using photography for social documentation. His letters reveal that he viewed photography not just as a technical achievement, but as a tool for preserving historical truth and human experience. He believed that this new art of light writing will revolutionize our understanding of history. Dubois had written to a colleague in Paris, "No longer will we depend solely upon the written word, or the artist's interpretation. We will be able to preserve the actual faces and forms of our contemporaries for future generations to study and understand." Dubois's collaboration with Beaumont had been motivated by both scientific and financial consideration. Beaumont had provided funding for Dubois's experiments in exchange for exclusive access to the new photographic techniques. The legal case involving the disputed enslaved people had provided an opportunity to test the practical applications of photography in legal proceedings. Would the correspondent also reveal that Dubois had been troubled by the ethical implications of his work? In a letter to his mentor in Paris, he had written, "I find myself in a position of great moral complexity. The technical success of my experiments brings me satisfaction, but the human cost of this success weighs heavily upon my conscience." Dr. Marie Rousseau, a specialist in 19th-century French photography at the Sorbonne, joined the research team to help analyze Dubois' techniques and motivations. Her expertise in early photographic processes provided crucial insights into the technical achievements represented by the Beaumont plantation photograph. Dubois was working with a modified daguerreotype process that he had developed through years of experimentation. Dr. Rousseau explained, "He had managed to reduce exposure times from the typical 15-20 minutes to just 33 minutes, which explains the remarkable clarity and natural expressions in the photograph." The technical analysis revealed that Dubois had also developed improved chemical processes that enhanced image stability and clarity. His innovations had been ahead of their time by nearly a decade, but his work had been largely forgotten because he had died in a yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans in Ethiopia. A rare photo of él nacido en Etios 20, South Carolina, that will haunt you. Dubois's personal journal, discovered in the Louisiana State Archives, provided the most revealing insights into his experience creating the plantation photograph. His entries from Marx de Etios 20 documented both his technical process and his emotional response to the subject matter. The technical aspects of today's work proceeded smoothly. He had read, the improved chemical preparation allowed for reduced exposure time, and the subjects remained remarkably still throughout the process. But I find myself deeply affected by the humanity I observed in their faces. These are not the savage beings that popular opinion would suggest, but individuals of dignity, intelligence, and profound emotion. Dubois had been particularly struck by the family dynamics he observed during the photography session. The parents' protective positioning around their children, the elderly woman's dignified bearing, the subtle communications that passed between the subjects, all spoke to a complex social structure and deep emotional bonds that contradict the prevailing assumptions about the nature of enslaved people. The journal entries also revealed that Dubois had been conflicted about his role in the legal proceedings. While he had been fascinated by the technical challenge of creating photographic evidence, he had been troubled by the use of his art to support a system he found morally repugnant. "I am caught between my scientific ambitions and my moral convictions," he had written. "The success of this experiment may advance the cause of photographic art, but it also serves to strengthen the bonds of human bondage." He prayed that future generations will use these images not to perpetuate injustice, but to understand and learn from this dark chapter of human history. Dubois's journal also provided details about the actual photography session that had created the image. The process had taken most of a day, with careful attention to lighting, positioning, and technical preparation. The enslaved people had been required to remain still for several minutes during each exposure, a challenging requirement that they had met with remarkable discipline. But Dubois had also observed moments of resistance and agency during the session. He had noted that some of the subjects had found subtle ways to assert their individuality and dignity despite being reduced to the role of legal evidence. The woman holding the infant positioned herself to shield the child from full view, he had written. The elderly woman maintained a bearing of such dignity that she seemed to transform the entire composition. The father's eyes held a mixture of pride and defiance that no amount of legal documentation could diminish. The discovery of Dubois' journal and correspondence provided crucial context for understanding the photograph's creation. It revealed that the image had been created by someone who understood both its technical significance and its moral implications. Dubois had been a reluctant participant in a system he found objectionable, but his artistic vision had preserved the humanity and dignity of his subjects in ways that transcended the original legal purpose of the image. The research team also discovered that Dubois had created several other photographs during his time in Charleston, but the plantation image was the only one that had survived. His other work had been lost to time, fire, and the general disregard for early photographic experiments. This made the Belmont Plantation photograph even more significant as a historical artifact. It represented not just early documentation of slavery, but also the work of a pioneering photographer whose innovations had been largely forgotten by history. Dubois' technical achievements and artistic vision had combined to create an image that served as both historical document and artistic masterpiece. As the research team continued their investigation, they began to understand that the photograph represented a convergence of technological innovation, legal necessity, and artistic vision that had resulted in an unprecedented documentation of human experience under slavery. The image was significant not just for what it showed, but for how it had been created and preserved. The completion of the research team's investigation into the Belmont Plantation photograph marked the beginning of a new chapter in understanding both the technical history of early photography and the human experience of slavery in America. The image that had arrived anonymously at the Charleston Museum had revealed itself to be one of the most significant historical discoveries of the 20th. Sarah Williams worked with her colleagues to prepare a comprehensive report on their findings for publication in the Journal of American History, but they also recognized that the photograph's significance extended far beyond academic circles. The image and the stories it contained deserved to be shared with the broader public as part of the ongoing national conversation about slavery, memory, and historical truth. The museum organized a major exhibition titled Faces of Resistance, Early Photography and the Human Experience of Slavery. The Belmont photograph, Serbo, is the centerpiece of the exhibition, surrounded by contextual materials that help visitors understand both its historical significance and its contemporary relevance. The exhibition's opening drew visitors from across the country, including historians, photographers, civil rights activists, and descendants of enslaved people. Many visitors spent long minutes studying the photograph, drawn to the individual faces and the stories they represented. One of the most moving responses came from Dr. Angela Washington, a genealogist who had been researching her own family's history. After studying the photograph and reading the accompanying research, she approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "He believed the woman holding the infant in the background might be my ancestor," Dr. Washington said. "My great-great-grandmother was named Patience, and family oral history says she lived on a plantation near Charleston in the 1820s. The timing and location match perfectly." This connection led to additional research that confirmed Dr. Washington's suspicions. Plantation records and family genealogies established that Patience was indeed Dr. Washington's ancestor, making the photograph a direct link to her family's history under slavery. To see my ancestor's face, to know that she existed as a real person with dignity and strength. It's overwhelming, Dr. Washington explained. For so long, our ancestors have been just names on documents or statistics in history books. This photograph makes them real in a way that nothing else could. The discovery led to connections with other descendants of the people in the photograph. Through genealogical research and DNA analysis, the museum was able to identify living descendants of Caesar and Dina's family, as well as several other individuals captured in the image. These connections transformed the photograph from a historical artifact into a living link between past and present. Descendants were able to see the faces of ancestors they had only known through family stories, and their oral histories provided additional context for understanding the experiences documented in the image. A rare photo of slavery in the 120, South Carolina, that will haunt you. The photograph also had significant impact on the field of photography history. Dr. Marcus Thompson's technical analysis of Henry Dubois's innovations led to a reassessment of the development of early photographic processes. Dubois' work was recognized as being far ahead of its time, and his techniques influenced the understanding of how photography had evolved. In the 1820s, photography museums and institutions around the world requested copies of the image for their own exhibitions and research. The photograph became a touchstone for discussions about the role of photography in documenting social history and the ethical responsibilities of photographers working in situations of inequality and oppression. The legal history revealed by Jennifer Hayes' research also had a contemporary relevance. The Commonwealth versus Beaumont case provided insights into how legal systems had been used to strengthen and perpetuate slavery, and how photographic evidence had been employed in service of oppression rather than justice. This case shows us how new technologies can be co-opted by existing power structures, Dr. Hayes explained in her analysis. Photography, which we might think of as a democratizing technology, was initially used to strengthen the very systems of oppression that it would later help to expose and challenge. The photograph's discovery also sparked broader conversations about historical memory and the preservation of difficult truths. The image forced viewers to confront the reality of slavery in ways that written documents could not. With the faces in the photograph made the abstract historical concept of slavery into a concrete human reality. Educational institutions across the country incorporated the photograph and its story into their curricula. High school and college students studied the image as part of courses on American history, photography, and social justice. The photograph became a tool for teaching about the importance of looking beyond surface narratives to understand the complex realities of historical experience. The research team's work also highlighted the importance of preserving and investigating historical artifacts that might seem unremarkable at first glance. The photograph had been discovered during a routine estate liquidation and could easily have been discarded or overlooked. Its preservation and investigation demonstrated the value of maintaining strong historical institutions and supporting the work of professional historians and archivists. As the first anniversary of the photograph's discovery approached, Sarah reflected on the impact of their investigation. The image had revealed stories that had been hidden for 2 centuries and had connected contemporary Americans with their ancestors in profound and meaningful ways. But perhaps most importantly, the photograph had preserved and honored the dignity and humanity of people who had been systematically dehumanized by the slavery system. Caesar, Dina, their children, and the other individuals in the image had found a way to assert their humanity even in the most constraining circumstances. Their faces, captured for legal purposes, had become a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of individual dignity to transcend systemic oppression. The photograph now hangs in the Charleston Museum's permanent collection, accompanied by the full story of its discovery and the people it depicts. Visitors continue to be moved by the image and the stories it contains. Many comment on the direct gaze of the subjects, the way their eyes seem to communicate across the centuries with contemporary viewers. In her final report on the investigation, Sarah wrote, "This photograph reminds us that history is not just about dates and events, but about individual human experience. The people in this image were not just victims of an oppressive system, they were individuals with names, families, hopes, and dreams. They found ways to maintain their dignity and humanity even in the most difficult circumstances, and their example continues to inspire us today." The Beaumont plantation photograph had achieved something that its creators never could have imagined. What had been created as legal evidence to support a system of oppression had become a powerful testament to human dignity and resistance. The faces that had been documented as properties had become symbols of the indomitable human spirit and the importance of preserving and honoring the stories of all people, regardless of their circumstances. The image that had arrived anonymously at a small museum had become one of the most important historical discoveries of the modern era, changing our understanding of both the technical history of photography and the human experience of slavery in America. Most importantly, it had restored the names, faces, and stories to people who had been forgotten by history, ensuring that their experiences would be remembered and honored for generations to come. The discovery of the Beaumont plantation photograph serves as a powerful reminder that historical artifacts can contain layers of meaning and significance that are not immediately apparent. Through careful research and analysis, we can uncover the human stories that lie beneath the surface of even the most formal historical documents. The faces in this remarkable image continue to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us of the importance of preserving and honoring the experiences of all people, regardless of their circumstances or social status.